have a lot of what I call Kristieisms, and here's one that fits into that comment. It has to be all about them before it can be all about you, before it can be all about us. Again, I walk into companies all the time, and the first thing I want to do is, I want to see email templates and scripts and things like that. And I just go, wow, I'm like, you guys think really highly of yourselves. Because that's all you talked about in 3 paragraphs.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. That was Kristie Jones. Kristie is the principal of the Sales Acceleration Group. And in our conversation today, we're talking about sales hiring in general, and in particular, Kristie's 5 steps for effective sales hiring. We first start by digging into the questions that companies should be answering internally in order to build a good hiring profile. And we explore the topic of why we rarely see hiring companies ask their buyers what qualities and skills do they need from your sellers in order to help them do their jobs. We dive into the topic of behavioral-based interviews. Kristie shares what this means, why these types of interviews are important, and also share some of her favorite questions to ask candidates. And then we get into the topic of assessment tests, and the role of assessment tests in the process of evaluating potential job candidates, and how to use these tests if you think they have value. Now, we get into all of this and much, much more, but before we get to Kristie, I want to remind you to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to it. And if you subscribe, we'd certainly appreciate it if you could also give us your feedback about how we're doing in the form of a review. So thank you. All right, let's jump into it. Kristie, welcome to the show.
Andy, thanks so much for having me today.
It's a pleasure to have you here. So you're joining us from where?
St. Louis, Missouri.
St. Louis, Missouri. Yeah, lots of our friends are in that area. Mike Weinberg and others have been on the show.
Yeah, Mike Weinberg is a good friend as well, and he is, he's nearby.
Yeah. So tell us a bit about you and what you do.
Sure. I've spent about the last 20 years in SaaS sales leadership. So about 14 of those as a director of sales, VP of sales. Titles are cheap and business cards are cheaper, I say. So call me whatever you want, and I can get $5 business cards for that. And then 6 years ago, I started my own consulting business. So I had spent all of this time in the SaaS startup world and wanted to continue to help SaaS startup founders help build out their sales process, their people, their tools, their strategies. And so I really play in that world. I would say majority of my clients are VC backed, but about 25% are not. They're bootstrapped. So sure. I like to help everyone get started and make sure that they're going to be successful and that they'll be around on year 5. Right.
And so the name of your company is?
Sales Acceleration Group.
So yeah, I sent you an email about this morning. That was the name of my company 20 years ago when I started it, and I own the domain that you own now.
That's nice. I thought that was an amazing coincidence.
Yeah, it was. It's like, okay, well, first of all, great minds think alike, right. and yeah, it's just when I was looking at your website, I was like, something's very familiar about that, and I was like, oh. Yeah, that was the name of my company before we changed it a couple times.
I appreciate you giving up the domain name.
Yeah, well, you're welcome to it. So I'm not sure I've seen anyone as invested in Kansas University football as you, though.
I'm actually really invested in Kansas University basketball.
Okay, well, that's a good thing.
I say I fly my flag with pride, but not during football season.
Okay. All right. But you've been writing about it. I mean, they did have a big victory recently.
We have to celebrate all of the victories because there are so few that I decided I needed to write. In fact, as you know, I wrote 2 blog posts because after I wrote the first one, something else crazy happened that really wasn't directly related to KU, but I'm all go Big 12 as well. So
you are all Big 12. You're unhappy about conference realignment. I think for people who care about this thing, you are unhappy about that.
Bitter might be, yeah.
Bitter,
and I still won't talk to the Mizzou people either for the same reason. So very upset about that.
Did they move? I haven't tracked recently. Did they go to SEC?
Yeah, a
Or
few years
ACC?
ago they left. Yeah, so it's interesting because we used to play. We used to do. We played them twice in basketball, of course, home and
Sure.
away, and then but we did a big. Their football game was always the Saturday after Thanksgiving,
Right.
and so
The
when they
big
left
game,
for the
right.
SEC, we were very bitter, and so we said, "We're canceling our contract. We don't want to play you. We don't want to play with you anymore." But we put our big girl pants back on, and we are doing our first basketball game with Mizzou in several years this Saturday. So the basketball is back on, and in 2023 we will resume playing them in football.
All right. Before we move on from sports, do you have tickets? Are you a ticket holder? Do you go out to Lawrence and watch games? Or
I am not. I'm a ticket buyer, but I'm not a ticket holder. So right now I have 3 games already purchased for basketball season. We have several of our teams in the Big 12 that are in the top 25 for basketball. So I have strategically chosen the games, and I believe the big game is going to be KU versus Baylor. I'm going to go ahead and put that out there that will be, I'm hoping that ESPN College Game Day, I'm going to go ahead and put my plug in now for College Game Day to come to the Baylor KU basketball game, please.
Yeah, I suspect they're not listening to this show, but you never know.
You don't know.
You never know. That's right. All right. Well, we were going to talk about a topic of mutual interest today, hiring, sales hiring specifically.
Yes.
And you've written a series of blog posts about the 5 steps to hiring the right salesperson.
Yes.
So your step 1 was putting together a hiring profile of the ideal candidate. So what's involved with that?
You know what, you need to sit down with normally for me, it's the founder, it is maybe all of the C levels, and really understand, not just requirements for the job itself, but obviously culture plays in a piece of that. I no longer say I'm looking for cultural fit. I'm now saying I'm looking for cultural add. So where can we bring some diversity into the situation, and gender as well. So, we write the job description, sort of the overview, what you're going to do, what the company does, what are the must-haves, what are the nice-to-haves, and then what's the cultural fit look like. I try to write it 2 ways. I try to write it so people are able to easily exclude themselves as well. I call it self-selecting. And then I take that job description and I run it through a gender neutralizer website, where it will tell me if I have written it dominantly on the masculine side or dominantly on the feminine side. And if it is weighing one way or the other, it'll say, here are the words that you've used that have made it such. Right. So that I can try to gender neutralize it. As you know, because you and I have mutual friends as Women's Sales Pro, my Women's Sales Pro group, who are actively working to get more women into tech sales. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I presume words like hunter don't make it through.
Yeah, crush it.
Aggressive.
Right. Aggressively pursue quota.
Right. Okay, all good. So one question for you, though, when because this is a shortcoming that I see companies don't think about and aren't intentional about thinking about when they're writing the job description, writing a ideal candidate profile or something, which is they're not asking themselves, what qualities and skills do our buyers need from our sellers to help the buyers do what they need to do? So true.
Traits are important. So I with some of my clients, I use a sales assessment or assessment called the Cultural Index. And it talks exclusively about traits. And I learned a lot. I had to go to 2 days of training in Dallas to be certified to be a Cultural Index individual. And one of the things I learned is that traits are set by the time you're 12. And so,
describe a trait.
A trait would be, kind of assertiveness or independence or team-oriented. Pardon me?
Personality-oriented?
Yeah. I mean, things that make you who you are, things that make you unique from another individual. And so they're set by 12, which is super interesting. I've taken this test several years over the years, and I'm always a trailblazer through and through. There are 18 profiles that come out of that assessment, and I've been a trailblazer ever since I first started taking the test. And they say that that's not going to change, but I keep testing them. So I think one of the things that's important is, what traits are going to be successful for the buyers that you're working with. Because I work, across industries, talking to an HR person, different from talking to an accounting person, different from talking to an engineer. C level versus V level versus D level. And so, but the interesting thing that I learned, and so I'm pretty firm about kind of the traits that go along with hiring, is that the concept here is because they're set at 12, you have a propensity to be comfortable in certain situations and uncomfortable in others. And if we take someone who has a nurturing trait, if you will, and try to make them a hunter, I say anybody can do anything for 30 days, call me on day 31. In this case, we say anybody can do anything for 9 months, call me, on month 10. But they will eventually either, they will fail in one of two ways. Either they will, cause their own demise by, imploding, or they're going to miss the target, right? And so trying to take someone who's a nurturer and ask them to cold call out to strangers is basically setting them up to fail. So one of the things I talk a lot with my clients about is let's make sure that we don't set someone up to fail by putting them in the wrong seat on the bus or hiring them for the wrong role.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of fit is hugely important. I wrote about this past week is much like there's product market fit, there's a fit for you as a seller.
That's right.
Because I don't think there's, as said in the post, I don't really think there are good sellers or bad sellers. I think you're either in the right situation or you're not.
That's right.
But it speaks to this idea of traits, though, because within one company, because I'm not very dogmatic about that. I mean, it's nice to have the data points, but I've seen people of widely varying personality types or traits succeed at the exact same job.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had the same situation a while ago. I say you can work harder, you can work smarter. I don't care which you choose to do, just hit quota. I personally think the work smarter strategy is better. But this comes into play. I was doing a panel discussion last week. Donald Kelly, if you know, the sales evangelist, came to St. Louis, and I was on a panel discussion with sellers. Our first in-person sales meetup in 2 years. Super exciting. But we talked about the fact that how women, like traits of women versus traits of men, right? And so, I worked with a woman who was a work harder. She was just going to outwork her male counterparts, but she had a very nurturing manner. And so she also spent more time with people. Her sales cycle was longer. She involved more people. And so I think when it comes to strategy, I think you can have, again, in that case, different traits. So the gentleman that she was most closely aligned to was on the Work Smarter program. He was very targeted with his accounts. He did a lot of research. He only wanted to talk to certain people. And so I do think, when I'm hiring for different roles, I do take I take the buyer role into consideration. Because again, who you're talking to and the technicality of the product that you're selling, those things all come into play. And so I think there's just I try to write the job descriptions in a way that helps people say that's me, or I don't think that's me.
Yeah, which I certainly much more attention has to be paid to, just for reasons as you expressed before about, we don't want to exclude people self-selecting out because there was overly masculine language used, and thus women say, well, that's not really going to be a fit for me, right?
Right.
But I think in general, I think companies have to do a better job of thinking, okay, what do our buyers need from a seller? Because, you look at the way we basically train sellers and let's say the reputation that salespeople have as, pushy and, uninformed. And, I just got through talking to someone that has done a lot of research into it. They've written a book that, 90% of senior executives say they get no value from talking to salespeople.
Right. Yep.
And that they just come in and talk about themselves first and it's like, well, that's learned behavior. To your point about traits.
Right.
I mean, natural and more innate behavior is like what I talk about in my new book coming out is like, desire. We're wired to want to connect with people. We're wired to be curious. We're wired to want to understand the world around us. We're wired to give generously. How do we end up in a situation where people have this expectation that they've come into this job, they got to put the sales hat on and act a certain way? Yeah.
I have a lot of what I call Kristieisms, and here's one that fits into that comment. It has to be all about them before it can be all about you, before it can be all about us. And so I tell sellers
go back through that again.
It has to be all about them before it can be all about you, before it can be all about us.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. So that's where, I walk into companies all the time, and the first thing I want to do is, I want to see email templates and scripts and things like that. And I just go, wow, I'm like, you guys think really highly of yourselves. Because that's all you talked about in 3 paragraphs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Try asking a question. All right. So you've done the description. I just want to try to cover more ground on the hiring thing. Is you have some pretty rigid criteria for screening resume. And I just wanted to run through some of those because there are just some people that shouldn't be getting in the door and getting more of your time and attention. And I'd see not enough companies, not enough hiring managers spend enough time screening. So what are some of the key things you screen for?
Again, here, this one's, I can't take credit for this one, but again, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. Mm-hmm. And so I'm looking for a track record of success. I'm looking for a track record of, taking some risks. So I do a lot of hiring for startups, right? The risk profile has to be high. This is a Kristieism. I say you have to be more willow than oak to work in a startup. So I'm looking for people that potentially, again, like if you've been working for a large corporation that probably has every single step already outlined and just gives you the playbook and you don't have to, like I call it, check your brain at the door. Mm-hmm. If you've been able to check your brain at the door, you're probably not a good fit for me. I love to hire certain types of people. So I love to hire former military leaders. I like to hire former athletes or current athletes. I like to hire people who've had some sort of challenge in their life.
Right. So go back to the athletes and the military leaders. What attracts you to those candidates?
Leadership skills normally in general. So with the athletes, it is discipline. Athletes have discipline, as do the military. As anybody coming out of the military has gotten discipline under their belt. They've all for the most part probably had some adversity. They've all lost, right? They've all lost the game. They've all lost a promotion. The military is very interesting because there's a lot of promotability there, but they have very strict criteria in order to get promoted. And you have to deal with all kinds of people. Like if you're a military leader, you don't get to pick your platoon, right? Mm-hmm. That's picked for you. Same thing in sports, in a sports situation, a sports team. You don't get to pick your teammates, but you have to figure out who to pass the ball to, when to pass the ball, when to pass the ball or to take that shot yourself, right? And so, going back to my, my sports days, KU has acquired, he will remain nameless, but he has acquired through the transfer portal a new player who at the last school, selfishness was not discouraged. Right. But at KU, Bill Self doesn't play selfish basketball. We play team basketball. And so we're trying to break him of his prior habits. And so you have to understand those kind of things. But if you've been in a team environment, for the most part, you have learned to work cooperatively. That means within, with prospects, with other departments within your organization. But you also got up at the crack of dawn, right, to get to practice. You also, if you're in football, you also practiced in the middle of August in Texas with pads on. So, you understand about hard work. You understand about the work ethic part of things. Same thing in the military. How many holidays did those people miss? How many birthdays did they miss? They were willing to make a sacrifice for the greater cause. And I think those people will make a sacrifice for the greater cause of a company as well.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I two of the best bosses I ever worked for were ex-military academy graduates. Mm-hmm. They teach people skills very well.
That's right.
So two things on your resume screen. One of which I really agree with, which is that deal breaker for you is spelling, grammar, and capitalization errors on a resume.
Yep.
Inexcusable these days. I mean, we're in a detail-oriented business, and if you can't be paying attention to detail, that's problematic for me. So I agree with that one. The one I was more curious about is, you said you disqualify people who are still living in mom and dad's basement.
I do.
So
yes.
You do realize that more than half of adults age 30 and under live with their parents. So
yeah, this has been a challenge for me.
So you're excluding half of the potential population pool?
There's a chance that that's the case. I'm the girl that will take, please don't put your address on your resume because I will Google map it. And if it's a 2-story Tudor home with a swimming pool, chances are slim that you may get through the door for me. I also used to plant myself at the window and watch them drive up as well.
What were you looking for when they drove up?
Just like whether or not the car that they're driving was as a result of them working at Chick-fil-A, or whether as a result of someone being a CEO at Chick-fil-A in their family. I do believe, again, some of the hardest workers I've had have been kids that didn't grow up, privileged.
Right.
And so, when you don't, this is, we're in a 50-50 split, right? 50 base, 50 commission. If you can live off your base salary, that's going to be a challenge for me as the leader in some cases, right? Unless your goal is to get out of mom and dad's basement, and you're pretty honest about that up front, like, I got to get out of the basement over here, so I got to get my own apartment. Times have changed, and I've had that rule for a while. I do still like seek out that information because I unfortunately, again, going back to future behavior and past behavior, I probably hired too many people who didn't have that ambition that I needed them to have because they didn't have to pay rent, and they didn't have to make the car payment, and they didn't have to pay insurance. And so when I want you to make $100,000 versus $50,000, I need to know that you're going to be hungry to do that. And, and again, like, what is your motivation? It's a question, like, what motivates you? And when they say money, I probe. I go, money to do what? Right? Because it's not just, money's a fine answer. Like, people used to say that was the taboo answer, like, you can't say money. And I go, money's a fine answer, but money for what, right? Money to better your family situation, money to better your education, money to get you out of mom and dad's basement. So, I think more than anything, I'm looking for ambition. And I understand that in today's world that sometimes you do have to go from college back to the basement, but I want to know that your goal is to get out of there in the next 12 months.
All right. Well, I was going to give you a hard time about the car payment thing. Very old school, because I that was when I got hired into sales, back in the late 1800s. That's what they were mostly asking about. Branch manager would always ask. And so I was driving at that time, a car I inherited from my great aunt. It was 13, 14 years old. She was a little old lady who had driven it to church on Sunday, basically. And the guy that was hiring me he hired me, but he was appalled at the car. First of all, that I would drive it to an appointment.
Right.
And so, he was, after me, gosh, weekly. When are you going to get a new car? When are you going to get a new car? When are you going to get a new car? Because that was the question they asked during the interview process back then is, so when are you going to get a new car? And it's like, so just I want that. I want the person with the 12-year-old car. That's what I'm looking out the window for. Because I know that they're afraid that thing is going to break down at some point, and they need to have the money to fix it or replace it. Yeah. Well, just to piss them off, when I got rid of it, I sold it to another guy in the branch.
That's awesome.
So, yeah. Stop bugging me about it. I'm selling it to Gary. He's going to drive it the next couple of years and drive you crazy.
Nice.
All right. So it's after you do your resume screen, something comes on. Next step, you do a phone screen.
Yes. So
again, this is something that oftentimes sort of done in sort of a drive-by fashion. And the reason we're sort of getting into detail on this, and I have a 5-step hiring process too. It's a little different than yours, but it's like, it's like with a prospect. You're qualifying people. Why do you want to waste your time and attention on people that aren't a fit? Not that they're bad people, just not a fit for your situation. So what do you do on a phone screen?
I ask, so the first thing I do is I compare it to your LinkedIn profile. So warning, if the dates don't match or the missing jobs, then we're going to start there. So again, I'm going back to attention to detail. So the first thing I do is I start there, right? And then you're going to get caught with your pants down, because that's the very first thing I'm going to say to you is, hey, it looks like there's an 18-month gap on, whatever, or it looks like the dates don't quite match up. I did eliminate a candidate recently who was none too happy with me. But he had taken his paper resume and rounded everything to the nearest whole year, which made his tenure at some companies look better than it was. I compared it to his LinkedIn profile and realized that the last 3 companies he'd been at fewer than 9 months. But on paper, it didn't look that way. And so, there's your fair warning that I will be comparing those first and foremost to your LinkedIn profile. And then I'll go back as far as
everybody should be conscious of that employers are going to look at your LinkedIn profile.
I'm not on Facebook, so good news. I'm not going to go stalk you on Facebook. I believe Facebook is the root of all evil, so I'm not participating in the Facebook game. But I'm all in on LinkedIn.
Right.
So then I'm going to go back 2 or 3 jobs, depending. Again, if it's an SDR, I'm probably only going to go back a job or 2 because that's probably all I got to work with, other than their time at Chick-fil-A. But if it's a AE or a different type of position, I'm going to go back relevant. I'm going to go back probably at least 5 years. And I'm going to ask 3 questions about all of those jobs. I'm going to ask them to tell me about their compensation structure. I'm going to ask them to tell me how they left the company better than they found it when they got there. And I'm going to ask them about their reason for change. I call it RFC. What was your reason for leaving and how did you find the next opportunity? Looking for a few things. So I'm looking for progression, right? I call it step change. I'm looking to see, again, the most ambitious people who are A players know when and where to make the next change. They know when to leave the current job when they've gotten all they can out of it, and they know what the next right job looks like for them in order for them to start at the 70% mark from a skill level and have to work their way back up to 100. And so I'm looking at that in 2 ways. I'm looking at that as a compensation situation, and I'm also looking at that as, your reason for change. Right. And then I want to know what you contributed, because if you, as an interesting aside, I interviewed a candidate yesterday, and when I asked her that question, those 3 questions, and then she said, interestingly enough, the question about how do I leave the job better than I found it is the reason I'm leaving the job. And I said, oh, well, tell me more. She goes, I can't see my contribution. She was at a very large Fortune 500 company, and she said, I just feel like I don't know if I'm contributing or not. I can't measure that. I don't feel like my day-to-day, activity is making a difference. And I thought that was one of the best answers I'd heard in a while.
Was she on target?
She was on target, but she just felt like she was a, cog in the wheel.
Yeah.
And she just didn't feel, and I said, well, then maybe the startup is the right place for you because there's nowhere to hide.
Yeah. Well, it's a question of fit, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, that works. So then after you do your phone screen, you have what you call behavioral-based interviews. So I'm interested in that because you had quite a long list of questions that you use. So tell us what this means for you.
Yeah, so this goes back to, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And I figured that out based on asking the tell me about a time when question. Most all behavioral-based interview questions will start with tell me about a time when. And I'm looking for a specific situation. So again, sometimes it's hard, right? Because the first question I ask every candidate is tell me about a time when you persuaded someone to make a change that was extremely reluctant to do so. Well, if you're an A-player sales rep, you do that every day, right? But I want a specific example. I want a specific prospect, coworker, boss, customer situation. Other situations I say is tell me about a time when the deal that you knew was going to close actually didn't. And what were the circumstances around that? Tell me about the last time you missed quota. So I need them to. I need to know, and I'm not looking for a specific answer. I'm looking more about how they process things, how they work through things. Are they? I call it. Are they willing to fall on the sword? Right. I said, tell me about my other ones. Tell me about a time when you took responsibility for a bad decision. Right. I'm looking for accountability there. So I do my questions based on competency topics. And so under each competency topic, I have behavioral based interview questions that tie to those. And then sometimes I ask just the regular question, like, are you more likely to ask for forgiveness or permission? Is one that people love to not answer. I get a lot of both.
Yeah. So what about questions that ask about values and character?
Yes. Tell me about the last time your integrity was challenged. Falls under the character and integrity category. I think you can. It's so funny. I asked that question, and people are hard pressed to come up with an answer. And I can give you 12 right off the top of right off the top of my head. Maybe that's because I'm older. But I asked that question, and I ask about, again, if you're in sales, if you've been in sales, I ask about how do you build trust and credibility, right? I want people to, I know that people need to feel like they can trust, and there is integrity around those things. So I have a lot of different questions that I ask, and I think over time, I spend a lot of time with them too. We're moving pretty quickly through the sales process now in under 2 weeks. But we're going to spend at least 3 hours with you in that period of time. But I openly say to the candidates, you will know well before I know if this is a good idea or not. So be real honest with yourself, because in the 3 or 4 hours we'll spend together, you'll know, you'll know whether this is a better fit than I will know if you're a better fit. I truly believe that. And so I say to the candidates, I'm going to do my best to make you an educated consumer so that you can figure that out, so that you can self-select if this is not the right fit for you. Okay.
So you're describing situations where you're hired by a company to help them, hire, you're hired to help hire people.
I am. It's all, yes, that all of the hiring I do is for other people now.
Right. So who at the company is participating in interviews? Because what I see as the more the state of the art of interviewing these days for jobs is that, there might be multiple people interviewing someone, but they all ask the same questions because that way they're able to compare notes on the answers they got. So how do you structure that with people in the company then interviewing?
Great question. And I'm in a little bit of a unique situation, which I love, by the way. I'm not working for companies so large that that's the case. So literally after I do the phone screen, that behavioral-based interview, normally the very top of the food chain joins me. Normally the owner, the CEO, the founder, the COO is joining me. So what an amazing opportunity for the candidates too, right? So I tell them ahead of time, we're going to be with the founder, and here's what you need to know about that individual, and make sure that the questions you ask, this is the person, right? This is whose baby you're going to be selling on a day-to-day basis. So, they're nobody's a harder critic than the person that birthed the baby, right?
Generally,
so,
yeah.
They're who's going to raise my baby? They're very particular about who raises the baby. So, in some cases, these interviews are harder, right? Because you've got the person whose livelihood, whose house is they put their house up, right, to get the bank loan. And so, but on the other side, what an amazing opportunity to know that, you get to talk to the person whose idea this was, who brought it to life, who's risking everything to make sure this works. So I do put them also in front of another employee. And I do that privately. I let them have a private conversation. And I say to the employee, hey, we've vetted them. They're qualified. We think they're cultural fit. But again, I go back to this educated consumer. I want them to understand, I let that conversation be private. I tell them the candidate can ask the employee anything that they want about the leadership, about the company, about the industry, about the process, about, what's the hardest part, get educated. And that's what I say to them. So I feel really strongly about that. I go back at the 60-day mark with candidates that have been hired and say, what didn't you know? What caught you off guard? What caught you with your pants down? Because I need to continue to improve the interview process so that they, and again, most of the time I hear, nope, it's what you said it was. Because the founders aren't always happy with me, but I'm on the transparency program. And so if we don't have funding yet, if we're not at Series A funding, then you need to know that. If we're deficient on some sales tools, then you need to know that. If we're still trying to figure out go to market or testing out new industries, you need to know that.
Right.
And particularly because that's the world I live in, which is uncertainty is an everyday reality. And so, we're not, I say I try not to hit the squirrel button every day, but, we may try new messaging every 60 days. And so if that, if you're not willow and you're oak, now's the time to figure that out.
So what I like to do is, what I found very effective is, so your next step after doing your behavioral questioning is you do an assessment. Is I like to use assessments and reference checks actually as a much earlier in the process before you invest the time to bring people in an interview. I'm just wondering, because to me, those are data points to say, okay, is this person a fit? So I like to do those, after the screen.
Good point. It depends. I mentioned cultural index earlier, and in fact, cultural index requires you to do it before you ever talk to anyone. Once you've gone through resumes and you have determined that, because again, they believe that if their traits do not match the job role, the needs of the job role, then it's a no fit and you don't even interview them at all, regardless of their skills or what they've done in the past. I fought that a little bit, but I get it now. I do the assessment about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through. And normally what I just call it is gut check, right? Like I'm not really, not really using my gut because I use the same interview questions and I know what I'm kind of looking for from an answer standpoint. But I use an assessment from Wiley and Sons out of Texas that I call ACT meets Myers-Briggs. Mm-hmm. It literally has a verbal and math section of numeric ability, numeric reasoning, verbal ability, verbal reasoning, which is very disagreeable for people who've been away from high school more than 8 or more years. They find that super disagreeable to get. I go, sharpen your number 2 pencil, get your paper out. Here we go. And then the Myers-Briggs part, right, is all about them, right? You want to swim with the sharks or swim with the dolphins. And it's not a pass-fail. I have taken my best A players over the years and put them into a composite profile and just said like, hey, like the majority of SaaS sales successful A players look like this. How do you compare? And the most interesting thing I find, and this is where like normally I get caught, this is the only time I get caught with my pants down normally, is sometimes they're an introvert. But I didn't catch that in the interview process because they're on stage, right? And everybody's on stage, and so they come across as an extrovert. But when I get them, energy level's low and team is low. And I go, hey, like I'm really surprised by this. And most people who are self-aware say, that's because I'm an introvert. And I was like, oh, well, now I got a whole bunch of questions for you, right?
No. Now you're just giving people a good go-to excuse. So
I am.
Now everybody that you talk to is going to be an introvert. Yeah, I mean, I mixed feelings about the value of assessments, though I think they're useful as a data point.
I do too. They're a tool in the toolbox. They're not a deal breaker. I mean, very rarely. Yeah. The only time they're a deal breaker is if the assessment lets me know that they did not consistently answer things. Their truth score was low. At that point, I got to throw the assessment out because it's not something I can use as a data point.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've told the story before on the show. A few years ago, took one of the leading sales assessments, and the score was apparently so shocking to the CEO of the company, they called me to make sure I hadn't had a mental breakdown or something. So, which has always been my conviction is that, if I were to take a career test, it would tell me to go be a shepherd as opposed to a salesperson. But I think that sort of speaks to the fact just how this is so hard to hire people because you don't know. As I made before, is one of the more successful salespeople I worked with at one client was pathologically shy. I mean, pathologically shy. I mean, after working with this client for 4 years, I was fractional there for 4 years. He still couldn't bring himself to talk to me or if you're sitting in the lunchroom together. And yet he was a killer on the phone. I mean, in terms of his personality.
How did he do? Was he inside or outside?
He was inside. But but eventually we got him, in sort of a hybrid role. And he would go out. And by killer, I mean, he helped buyers. He closed deals because he just knew the buyers inside and out. And they felt incredibly comfortable and confident and built tremendous amount of trust. But, people skills unfortunately, were something he really had to work on all the time. He was aware of it, but I mean, it was painful for him. And so I always use that as one example. I've got many more. It's like, this is such a tough business because different types of people can succeed doing the exact same job. I think where the rub is these days is that you get more and more inexperienced managers saying, well, we have to follow this process precisely and this playbook precisely. And myself and 3 other people with different personality traits are going to say, well, that may not align with how I could do this best. Yep. And anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. I wrote a blog post recently about, do you understand your sales superpower?
Right.
And I spend a lot of time talking to people about that because what my superpower is won't be your superpower, won't be somebody else's superpower. But do you have awareness around your superpower? And do you know, have you honed it? Have you put it into play in a competitive situation? Do you know when it's your go-to? Do you know when the chips are down, how to use it to get you back, above water type of thing? And I think, I think those are I think those are things that sales reps don't spend enough time talking about. I use a few different phrases there, like, do you know what your swim lane is, right? Do you know if you should be selling a product or a service or software? Should you be in B2B? Should you be in B2C? I talk about really understanding where your home is, where you can be the most successful. And that went back to kind of what I said, like, did you understand what the next, right step was? Are you taking the next right step in your career? And again, it's okay to make a bad career step. I'll give you mine. I spent the first 8 years as a buyer for a department store, then got disenchanted with that, got into subscription-based selling because it wasn't SaaS back then, subscription model, that's how old I am. And then I got bitten by the VC-backed bug. And so I took a job at a company that was VC-backed. The CEO and the COO had just saved Breyer's ice cream from, destruction, from literally melting down.
They were a customer of mine back in the day. I sold them a computer.
So these two individuals I called them guns for hire, right? They sort of worked for the VC. They saved Breyer's ice cream from meltdown, literally, and then came in to save a holistic dog food and cat food company. And I was like, wow, I got enchanted. I was like, ooh, I could run I was going to run the Canadian team. I was going to run the inside sales team. Everybody was so smart. The interview process was so hard. And I got in there and I was like, oh my gosh, what am I doing in CPG? Like, what have I done? Like, I know how long it takes to make food. Like, I don't care if it's dog food. It takes a long time. And all of a sudden, I've got to call distributors because we're missing, we can't produce product because we can't get ingredients because they're these weird organic ingredients. And I was like, oh my gosh. Again, on the good news side, my self-awareness is high, and I was in and out of there in 10 months. But I tell people, when people talk to me and say, like, what's the biggest mistake you made? And I say two things. One, not joining the racquetball team at Southwest Missouri State and taking a job in CPG. Yeah. But I knew right away, so it was okay. So I say to people I didn't wait years to get out. I got out in under a year, and I felt, that's not my normal MO. I just told you I stayed at a company for 10 years, that e-learning company, that I started my SaaS career in. I was there for 10 years. So I like, loyalty is a thing for me. But all of a sudden, I was like, oh my gosh, I've made a huge mistake. And I knew I was not going to be able to be my best. They weren't going to get the best out of me. And I wasn't going to be able to learn what I wanted to learn. And so I say dog food and cat food aren't sexy, but tech is.
Yeah, but I think the lesson is for sellers is that you have to operate with intention.
That's right.
Much as you do in selling to your customers, you have to be intentional about every step of the interaction, every interaction you have with them, every step along the way. Yes. So too with your career. And if you're just floating, going from job to job, so without a plan, then
that's right.
Problematic. So, all right.
Yeah, I'll tell you one more story because I kind of liked your story. But one more story about one of the best sales reps I ever worked for and understanding themselves. I hired at the SaaS e-learning company that I mentioned. I hired a gentleman, and I was using this assessment at the time, and I required the candidates take it on site. And I'd gotten him through a recruiter, and the recruiter called me and said, can this candidate take it at home? And I was like, I don't know, like that, can't use the calculator for the math part. And, I'm kind of a rules girl. So I was like, it kind of breaks the rules. And he was a friend. And so he talked me into it, and I said, sure. And I hired the guy, loved him. And in the first couple of days, he came to me and he said, hey, I want to know if you'll be willing to buy me a software program. And I said, okay, well, tell me more. And he goes, it's called Naturally Speaking. And Dragon Naturally Speaking. And I said, so I grab my computer and I go, oh, it's voice translation. And he goes, yeah. And I go, do you just think you can be more efficient with it? And he says, no, I have dyslexia. You don't want me writing anything. And I was like, wow, which is why he had to take the assessment at home, because his wife had to read it to him. It was important enough to him. And he had help all through college. He'd had a proctor all through college that helped him, went to class with him.
So
and one of the most successful sales reps, today he sells God. Back then he sold software, but he's a pastor now. So he literally sells God, I tell people. But one of the best sales reps I had with an extreme learning disability situation, but learned over time how to work around it. But here's what he had that other my sales reps didn't. He had a connection with people, right? He had honed his people trait to an extreme because he had no choice. And he was funny. And he said, when we talked about it, when we got to know each other, and we're still friends today. I talked to him a week or two ago, and he hasn't worked for me in 15 years, 16 years probably. And I said to him, we talk about it often. And he says, I had to diffuse people and I had to charm teachers and professors. And I used my humor because he said, you couldn't call on me. I would freeze up. Right. Yeah. I wasn't in school before I got the help I needed, calling on me I was terrified, but I could diffuse the situation with humor. So he also became super funny. And so those are the kind of things like when you read the book Grit, and you talk about bounce back factor and grit and those type of things being important and having some sort of struggle that you've overcome. Right. I don't it'd be interesting. I don't know the answer. If he had told me that and confessed that during the interview, what that would have done for me. I also have a sibling who has a learning disability, so I probably would have been empathetic and compassionate in the situation. But boy, it made him amazing. And now that we got the pandemic, I've had a chance to hear him preach online. Right. And so now he's doing what he really loves, but he's still selling every day. Right. He's just selling a different product and service than most of us. But, he's dynamic. He's engaging. He sucks you in. When you talk about diversity, it's not just minority. It's not just men versus women. There are lots of other ways to bring in that's where I said earlier that I no longer want cultural fit. I want cultural add. And people like that bring cultural add to a company.
Perfect. All right. Well, Kristie, we are running out of time. So thank you for joining me. For people that want to learn more about you and the Sales Acceleration Group, where can they find you?
Please connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm fairly easy to find. I'm out of St. Louis, Missouri. I'm Kristie with a K. And then go to my website, salesaccelerationgroup.com. Go to the blog page, 60 blog posts all about hiring, sales leadership, how to hold your prospects accountable. My blog post is chock full of good things to digest, especially as we're coming to the end of the year and starting a new one.
Excellent. All right. Well, Kristie, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Paul, thanks so much for having me on.
All right. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Okay, friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. I'm so grateful for your support of the show, and I want to thank my guest, Kristie Jones, for sharing her insights with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. So thank you for your help with that, and thank you so much for investing your time with me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.